Conrail and CSX track inspection cars have arrived in HO scale from Broadway Limited Imports. Packed with prototype-specific details and BLI's touch control lighting, you can activate interior and exterior lights instantly. No wand or decoder programming needed. Never before mass-produced in plastic, these distinctive executive cars bring modern railroad prestige to your layout. Reserve yours before August 27th from your favorite BLI dealer. Your scenery tells part of the story. Scale Signs fills in the details. With thousands of realistic railroad, street, traffic, and business signs, plus custom artwork, Scale Signs brings every scene to life. Find the signs that your layout has been missing at scalesigns.com. Scale Signs, because the smallest details can make the biggest difference. Need a curve turnout that actually fits your layout? Oak Hill Model Railroad Track Supply has you covered with Roadmaster flexible turnouts. Just follow your center line on benchwork, a track plan, or even a scaled aerial image and build the turnout to match your railroad. No complicated jigs, fixtures, or fixed geometry. Roadmaster flexible turnouts from Oak Hill Model Railroad Track Supply. Take 10% off with code FLEX at ohrtracksupply.com. Don't miss the annual New Haven Railroad Convention and Train Show, September 11th through 13th in New London, Connecticut, presented by the New Haven Railroad Historical and Technical Association. Learn more about them and this exciting event on their website, nhrhta.org. ATLP Extra is our monthly newsletter delivered right to your inbox each month. Sign up for free at atlpextra.com.
ATLP Rewind.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Joining me on this show, coming from Western Massachusetts, Neil Schofield. Neil, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for having me. So I guess it's Merry Christmas, too, or day after Christmas.
Yeah, recording on the day after Christmas. So Merry Christmas to you. I hope you had a fantastic holiday with your family, and great that you were able to take some time out of your schedule. You've been somebody I've been pursuing for a little bit of time here to try to get you on the show, and I'm so thrilled that I've reeled you in. And I'm gonna kind of point you out a little bit here. I ran into you at Amherst. I think it was a couple years ago. I think it may have been the snow year that I had run into you.
Yeah,
and I had asked you to come on the show, and you were a little leery about coming on, and you had your reasons. But then you proceeded to talk to me for about 55 minutes or so, which I said, if I just had a recorder, then we would be all done with this and I'd have you on the podcast. But I'm certainly glad that you've agreed to come on and tell your story here, because I am more than sure you have a great one. I've been following you on YouTube, your NRS 8400 channel, beautiful layout. And I will someday get north of Connecticut here and go up and see your layout. But for now, I'm going to learn a bit about it. And along with everybody else that's listening and those that haven't seen it on YouTube, we'll be sharing those links. But an absolutely outstanding layout you have with your CP Rail, Newport and Lyndonville subdivisions. So looking forward to talking a bit about that. But as we always seem to do in the podcast, I want to get right to it and ask you, Neil, how did you get started in the model railroading hobby?
Well, thanks, Ray. I appreciate the kind words as well. I think I was very fortunate growing up. My father was actually very much into the hobby. My earliest memories from about 7 years old were off with him rail fanning, or I grew up with a layout in the basement. He had his own layout. It was a good size layout at about 24 by 32 foot basement filled with a steam era layout. So I was very fortunate to grow up with a layout that he had. And he also had a round robin group of guys, good friends of his, that we used to, every Friday night, we would go to a different layout. And so from, like I said, from the time I was about 7 years old until I was probably 14, and I had a few other interests, Friday nights I would spend with Dad and a lot of good friends. Unfortunately, many of them have passed, but John Taylor, Bill Robertson, Charlie Clark, Edward Gay, to name a few. We're all really good friends growing up, and an influence too on me from a young age, because they knew me from the little brat that played with Dad's trains in the basement right up through college and stuff. So.
Were you able, when he was running with this group and doing operations, how much were you involved in that?
I got involved at a young age. I mean, my father, God bless his heart, was very patient, and he encouraged me in the hobby. And I had another friend of ours, John Taylor. He had a son who was probably, I think Johnny's 8 years older than I was, but Johnny was very much into custom painting locomotives, and this is probably in the late 70s, early 80s. So he was a very big influence on me early on in terms of getting into custom painting and detailing locomotives. At the time, it was Boston, Maine. Eventually, we got into the Delaware and Hudson. But so between him and my dad encouraging, we were very much, I was very involved in the hobby from a young age. And I got a funny story. I'll kick it off. When I was in my early teens. My dad had like I said, a large layout. It was a steam era layout, and at the time this was pre-DCC and everything. But he had a couple big yards, and it was steam era, and it was called the Neponset Ridge Short Line. And he had a bunch of steam engines, and he had some diesels and stuff. And one of my favorite things to do as a kid was to basically take over his layout. So by the time I was about 12 years old, I had started custom painting, I think, Ather and Blue Box B&M Jeep 9s and Central Vermont GP9s. So I had a couple of friends of mine who used to come over, and I would take all the steam engines and 40-foot boxcars off and put on the diesels and the CV. And he had two major yards. One I'd set up as like White River Junction. The other I set up as Brattleboro. And we would operate the layout. My dad would come home, and he had a lot of patience to accept it. He never complained when I was taken over his layout. He just, like I said, he really encouraged it from a young age. So I was very fortunate for that.
That little brat brought the transition era right to his steam layout with all those details.
Yeah. So he was really encouraging about it and stuff. So, and we, all the guys I mentioned before in the round robin group were also very talented individuals as well. So I got to learn at a young age. A good friend of ours, Ed Gay, was into craftsman structures, but he actually scratch built craftsman structures from wood. And he was well known in the round robin group for some just fantastic structures that he would build. And so I got to learn that. A good friend of ours, Bill Robertson, who was into operations. Bill loved operations. And so I got to see a lot of operating sessions. So by the time I was probably my early teens, let's say 13, 14, that was when I started to enjoy operations too, a little bit more. Of course, that was at the time, it was still DC. This was probably 10, 12 years before DCC really took off, and never mind sound and everything else. But it was just a great experience. I mean, I was very fortunate, like I said, to grow up with, again, a very patient father, that's for sure.
Well, it definitely gives you a head start on things when your dad is into model railroading and already has a layout. And sounds like he had quite the support system and a great group of friends that was able to pull information and share that, which is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Let's put a little geography on this. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Mansfield, Mass. So that's southeastern Massachusetts, down by not far from Foxborough Gillette Stadium.
Right.
And, so we actually grew up, probably a stone's throw from the Northeast Corridor. I mean, I could hear trains from my bedroom window, and I can remember it. Even before. This is probably when I was 5 or 6 years old. On Saturdays or Sundays, if my father was out doing yard work or something, he'd have the bike in the driveway. And if we heard, sometimes you'd hear a freight, he would jump on the bike and throw me in the little seat behind the bike and actually paddle up the top of the hill. We lived on School Street in Mansfield, and we could see the trains going by. I mean, most of my early recollections were some Penn Central, and then later Conrail and Amtrak and the MBTA, of course, were the primary operations. But yeah, those are my fond memories of growing up in Mansfield when I was a kid.
Yeah, you definitely grew up in a great railroading area, being Mansfield, Mass, and that line between Boston and New York. There, you mentioned the Northeast Corridor and a lot of traffic, a lot of different things to see. You mentioned rail fanning with your dad, which I just think is a really cool thought too. Not only you're doing the model railroading part, but seeing the prototype with him as well. Where beyond just the Northeast Corridor, were there any other rail fanning adventures you would do with Dad?
We would, yeah. Every Memorial Day, we used to do a trip with the same round robin group of guys, and we would go to various places throughout the Northeast. And I think one of the areas that we hit quite a few times was down the Cumberland, Maryland area. And there was people are familiar with that. Remember the Holiday Inn? So I can remember going down there. I was probably, 10 or 11 years old. And we used to stay in the holiday room, and I think it was the 7th floor trackside. And you used to just sit up there, and you could overlook the Cumberland train station, and you were at would be the west end of Cumberland Yard. So all the westbounds used to come up, and they would stop just in front of the station to wait for helpers or crew changes. And just fond memories of going down there. We would go down there. I think we probably went down there 5 or 6 times over the course of a 10-year period when I was growing up. So we did the Cumberland, Maryland area. We did Cass Scenic. We actually did a trip when I was in high school. We actually went up to Montreal, and that was the first time I think I had just gotten my license actually. And we got to get to drive in Canada of all places. But on the way back to the States, we actually came down through Newport, Vermont. So that was 88, 89 after the era of modeling. But it was the first time I actually got the chance to see operations in Newport, Vermont. And they were still running decent-sized trains. So I have fond memories of my dad and I. We drove into Newport Yard and Newport, Vermont, and there was a train just leaving. So we zipped around, and we ended up getting a train coming through right by what was called Quebec Central Junction at the time. And that was a fond memory too. And that was certainly an inspirational one for later on as well.
Wow. So this wasn't just casual rail fanning. This was some pretty serious stuff. I mean, trips from Maryland all the way up to Montreal, Quebec, and places in between. You guys were really into this whole thing together, which is just, again, to me, and I keep tickling this, but when I hear the father-son relationships, it's just pretty amazing to me how tight knit it is through model railroading and even the prototype.
Yeah, for sure. It's just a great way to spend the hobby and have an interest together. And it's certainly the type of hobby that extends, well past your teens. Obviously, my dad was just here yesterday for Christmas. So it's great, to still share that hobby for sure.
Absolutely. And your dad's still active in model railroading. In fact, I saw him at the New England Model Train Expo with a hub put on, and I saw him there, and I've seen him all around the place. He's still very active in the model railroading scene. Yeah.
He's been a member of I think he's one of the founding members of the Province Model Railroad Club. So he's over there every Saturday, holding court, so to speak.
That's fantastic. So let's get back to you a little bit. You talked about hitting teenage years and maybe a little disinterest, or you kind of, off on a different path. But when does model railroading kind of re-enter the equation?
I didn't really lose interest to too much. I guess maybe I just spent more time being a little bit more social with friends and stuff like that through my teen years. But sure. I kept interest all the way through, even in college. I probably did more rail fanning in college than obviously modeling for obvious reasons. But in the summers, I would come home and do some modeling to some degree. And then once I graduated in 96, I ended up out in Pittsfield, Mass. My girlfriend at the time ended up getting an internship in Pittsfield. So I ended up moving into an apartment with her in Great Barrington. So that was a lot of fun too, just because Western Mass, I was able to get quite a bit of rail fanning at the time out in Pittsfield on the B&A at the time. So we did a lot of that through college. And that was actually where I had my first layout, was just in a little apartment in Great Barrington.
Before we leave that time period, you said you went to college and did rail fanning. Where'd you go to college, and what were you rail fanning?
I went to UMass Amherst. So at the time, I was If I missed a class or two, I might sneak up. I hope my dad's not listening, but yeah, if I
you,
missed,
you may be past the point of what was it, the statute of limitations may have worn out on that one, so you might be okay, Neil.
yeah, I did. I basically rail fanned some of the Con River at that time. I actually would sneak off sometimes too for weekends. I would sneak off down to Binghamton, New York, which was it was a good 3 hours, 3.5 hours from Amherst. But I would sneak off here and there and do a little rail fan. Not too often, but certainly sometimes I would get out and rail fan whenever I had the opportunity, or I could sneak off a little bit. So,
and I'm sure you brought your books with you and you did some studying in between trains. I'm sure you made it very useful. Yeah,
of course I did. Yes, I was a studious student, so to speak. But yeah. No, I got a little bit of rail fan done in college for sure. So
that's awesome. But now you end up in Pittsfield, and now you said you started building a small layout there. Tell us a little bit about it.
It wasn't much. It was this again. This was DC days, so I had a small 2 foot by 6. We lived in an apartment for about a year, and I was kind of starting to get anxious, just to get. I had all these diesels that I had built when I had grown up, and some freight cars and stuff. So once I had moved out of the house and I didn't have access to my dad's layout anymore, the interest was still there, and I started to get excited to try building something on my own. And of course, space was always in an apartment is always limited. So I started with a small 2x6 layout, and it never got past the track work. I got track work installed, and I had a DC portable throttle that actually worked pretty well. So I was able to set up a little switching and stuff, but it never got past scenery or anything. Like, there never got past track work. Actually, never got to scenery.
Well, to get the fire kindled a little bit and burning, and you're able to get a little bit of model railroading in. And in the interim, Dad's layout, I imagine, still there. I mean, were you making trips home and able to operate on that?
I was, yeah. Occasionally, I was able to get home and do a little operation there. But I think too that was into the late '90s. At that point, the Providence Model Railroad Club had started up, so I was a member even when I was in Western Mass. I started to become a associate member, I think. So I used to go down there, every couple of weeks. If I came home or something like that, I might go down with my dad to the Providence Model Railroad Club and spend time. And that was a great opportunity. Railroad clubs are great like that you can actually bring equipment down and run trains and get exposed to exposed to a lot of good modeling. And at the time too, DCC was taking off, and that was a lot of great exposure in terms of learning about DCC and how it worked and stuff too.
Yeah. So your dad's starting, it was the Providence Northern Model Railroad Club. And then you mentioned that he already had a pretty good group of friends. And then the club, did a lot of those come with him to the club to help start that?
Some of them did. Yeah. There were certainly a couple guys that were part of the founding members of the club. Some didn't. I mean, clubs are really great for getting exposed, especially if you don't have your own layout. But I think we all know clubs come with politics too.
Yep.
And there was a lot of politics with it, good or bad. I mean, my dad could. My dad was in construction, so he was a project manager in construction, so he could be a little vocal. Is the way I'd put it lightly. But he just wanted to have everybody enjoy the club. So, but there was a lot of politics, I think, so that might have discouraged some people. But I think the majority of people just wanted to go there and just run trains, which was the great part of the club for sure.
That's one thing we do talk about quite a bit on the podcast, and those that are looking to get a start or get a taste of it, a club is a great environment for that. And it's certainly a great social aspect as well to start meeting people. I met my mentor in a model railroad club, and, it sounds like you had quite a few great guys in that club as well. And it's just great to meet people, learn things. There's a lot of great takeaways from being a member of a club.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, like I said, at the time, DCC was just kicking off. So everything from decoder installations to learning about installing a tortoise switch machine, or how does a DCC system get installed? What's a booster? All those things I learned through a bunch of guys at the club, not just my dad, but a bunch of other guys. So that fueled a lot of energy too towards, okay, I'm starting to gain all this knowledge. I would actually like to put it towards my own personal layout too. It's a natural transition. I think once you get in the club and you eventually we can talk about it, but I did get a house, and like every smart person, my wife went upstairs and I went downstairs to look at the basement.
I think every real estate agent that must know who a model railroader is when they see the husband head for the basement and the wife heads to the kitchen and all the other rooms.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was, the club was a great aspect to kind of fuel those desires to get my own place too. As you learn so much, it's like, well, boy, I'd like to be able, I don't want to have to debate. Sometimes that's a nice thing about transitioning from a club layout to your own personal layout, is you don't have to debate anybody. It's kind of you're in charge. That was something I did enjoy too. So
I'm a big fan of democracy, but it doesn't work in every situation. And sometimes these clubs, the democracy can be a little tough to try to get things figured out. And yeah, when you get your own and now you can make all the decisions, it's definitely it's good to be the king, as Mel Brooks once said. So so you've got yourself. You mentioned that you purchase a home, and you got yourself a decent basement. It sounds from your explorations while you're shopping. So tell me what the next step is in your progression of model railroading.
Yeah, so we bought a house in Seekonk, and fortunate enough, I think there was, I'm trying to remember the dimensions of the room. There was a finished basement or finished room in the basement that was about 18 by 22, something like that. And it actually had the ability to widen one wall. So basically there was a large closet adjacent to the finished room. So when we moved into the house after a few months, I had my brother-in-law come over, and my dad actually came over, and we actually took the wall and actually moved the wall 6 or 8 feet to make the room even bigger. And so we ended up with it was like a 24 by 26 foot room or something like that. I was able to start my own layout there. And it was, at the time, it was based on the CP rail in Vermont, loosely based on the CP rail in Vermont, but I had a little bit of modeler's license in there too. So
you went from Pittsfield back over to the eastern side of Massachusetts. That must have been nice to be able to build a layout and have your dad kind of close at that time too.
Yeah, it was definitely nice to be. There was a lot of reasons at the time. My wife at the time and myself, we both were from Eastern Mass. She was actually from Rhode Island, so Seaconk's kind of right on the Massachusetts-Rhode Island border. It was just nice to be closer to family too, both her family and my family. At the time, my daughter was born in the house, so it was just nice to be a little bit closer to family and everything as the family started to grow. So it was definitely good.
Yeah, and then of course, having you building this layout, I'm sure Dad was over there and giving you a hand and kind of cheering you along as you were building this layout in the basement.
Oh yeah. He's my big proponent and was always happy to share photos and stuff of I'd take a picture and then he'd take a picture and share it with all his friends. I used to joke he was my publicist though. But yeah, so it was really good. It was nice to have a place to actually start running trains and start to have operating sessions and things too.
So you mentioned the layout was based on CP rail, and obviously you talk about being from Eastern Mass and spending some time in Western Mass and stuff, and that rail fanning trip that you did to Montreal and your trip back must have laid a big impression on you, because CP rail doesn't really run in this area. So tell us why CP rail, how that all developed for you.
Yeah, so probably some of my earliest recollections, getting back to my dad's layout and kind of mentioned taking over his layout, but there was some really interesting articles back when I was probably about 9 or 10 years old in the early 80s on the Cotton River lines. I think Ben Bachman had done it in the Trains magazine, and it was actually a multi-part article that talked about Central Vermont, CP Rail, and Boston, Maine operations on the Conn River line, which is essentially a line that runs from Springfield, Mass, up to White River Junction and then splits. One line goes north to the CP rail at Newport, and the other line goes to Central Vermont, goes to St. Albans. But that was really an influential article. Because I was very fortunate too. My dad would get all the model railroad and trains articles every month, so I had access to those. But that was a very inspirational article at the time. And that's when I started to get into the Central Vermont and Boston, Maine at that time, and converting blue box, Atherton blue box into Central Vermont and B&M engines. So that was what really got in my head, the operations on the Conn River line. So in the back of my mind, I was also a big Delaware and Hudson fan, but ultimately, in terms of envisioning a layout someday, really, I guess in the back of my mind from that age, around 1980 or so, I knew I wanted to model either somewhere on the Conn River line. And ultimately, I just decided to go a little bit further north on it with the CP operations. So
you mentioned that one trip. Were there other trips up there and other rail fanning opportunities? Were able to make those site visits and be able to see the area that you were modeling quite a bit?
I did, yeah. So my had first gotten my license. I wasn't even, I think I was 17. I was 16 and a half at the time. And I had always wanted to go to St. Albans, Vermont, in the center of Vermont. And I can remember, this is long before cell phones and pay phones and stuff. And I remember I had only had my license for a couple months. And I can remember calling my mom from a cell phone collect. I said, "Mom, I'm going to be a little bit late." She goes, "Why? Where are you?" "Well, I'm in St. Albans, Vermont." Yeah. I don't know how old I was. So, but it was probably, 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. And I had spent the whole day kind of rail fanning the CV Italy yard, and then getting a bunch of pictures, and knew I wasn't going to be home before whatever time it was. It was about a 5-hour ride from home.
Yeah, that's for anybody that doesn't or isn't familiar with Vermont, St. Albans is way up there.
Yeah.
Well, let's call St. Albans almost Canada.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, just up, I would say, what is it? Maybe 45 minutes to the Canadian border from St. Albans.
I would say, if that, it might even be closer than that. So yeah, that was, they were patient with me. They understood, but that was the inspiration. When you get your license, you get that sense of freedom. And that was, to me, was finally to get to actually see some of these places that I had read about in that trains article and only seeing photos of magazines and stuff. It was finally nice to actually see those. Of course, the operations this was, I want to say 88, somewhere in that time frame. And things had changed quite a bit in the hobby. Railroading changed in New England quite drastically in the 1980s, and for various reasons, but it was still just a great opportunity to kind of see some of these places that I'd only seen in photos previously.
And it's kind of funny, the tie in between you and I. I'm a big New England Central fan, which is followed the Central Vermont that you admired and were able to go see. So I'm imagining just the cool things that you got to see. That I've been to St. Albans and I've seen it, but I certainly wouldn't call it in its heyday. And certainly you would probably have seen a lot more action and a lot more things in St. Albans than I would have in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. I think I actually, just the other day, I was downstairs looking at the 110 prints that I had at the time of the CV's SW1200s that they had. And there was, I think, 3 or 4 RS11s in the deadline at St. Albans Yard. So in the afternoon, when nobody was looking, I snuck in. I got all over them, climbed all over them, took photos and stuff. At the time, I was still am, but I was big into detailing. So I took tons of prints just to kind of someday, with the envision of someday modeling some of them. So yeah, that was great. Unfortunately, I wanted to see the SW1200 running, but they were in the deadline at that time. So there was still Jeep 9s in the engine facility. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, you got to see it, and you were wise enough to snap as many pictures as possible. And another thing that, we beat to death on this show about taking photos. And if you feel like I do, that you missed the golden era, just keep taking photos, because eventually it will become a golden era to somebody else. And, as things change and evolve in prototypical railroading, grab a hold of them like you did up there in St. Albans.
Yeah. It's funny is my day job, believe it or not, we actually manage the stormwater treatment system at East Deerfield Yard. So for CSX and now for Berkshire Eastern under Genesee and Wyoming. So we have a couple treatment plant operators, just manage the stormwater system. And I just manage the project. But on occasion, when some of our operators are down, I guess who gets to be the operator and spend 8 hours at East Deerfield Yard. So it's actually pretty cool and to go there. Even now with the transition going on between CSX to Berkshire Eastern, I mean, we actually have to manage a couple of the stormwater systems right at the engine terminal. So I actually get to walk right up to the engine terminal and walk around. But it's just amazing having, I think the first time I went to East Deerfield, where I was probably 9 years old and it was all B&M at the time. But now to see the transition, to see all the different power and everything, it's like you said, it's just a great opportunity to, I have to be very careful about taking photos, but just to take photos and see this transition and imagine what it's going to be like in 10 years, it's actually a great opportunity to take those photos and grab them if you can.
Yeah, that's a yard that's, evolving as much as the railroad is and, different buildings. But it's also fun to go to East Deerfield, Mass. That's another great yard if anybody's looking to rail fan and be around. Because there's a lot of cool ghost railroad opportunities. You can still see where a lot of structures were, and it's a neat place to be for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of history there, and just the Railfan Bridge. I mean, when people talked about Railfan Bridge in the 80s and even the 90s, it was just you automatically knew it was East Deerfield. So yeah, it was just a lot of history there.
Yeah, so you got to get up to St. Albans, a nice long trip up there, and got to capture a lot of stuff that you're able to use in the future. But that's your involvement in CP and your passion for it, and was all gathered by that Railfan trip and some site visits. And so tell us what you start modeling as your first layout.
So the first layout that I had, the house in Seekonk, was based on CP and CP operations. I actually modeled Newport Yard, but at the time I was probably not as disciplined as I should have been. I mentioned I grew up in Mansfield, and there was a junction in Mansfield that was actually originally the old Colony, Maine, that broke off from the New Haven, Maine. And there was just a really nice, small, compact yard there that had a freight station and a feed and grain dealer. And I was always inspired by that. So what did I do? My first layout based on CP operations, I had one whole segment that was dedicated to the Mansfield freight yard. And I just assumed it was a CP that went through it. So I wasn't disciplined. It was a little bit fictional, maybe too fictional for my liking at the time. And but the layout got up and operational. I had probably a third of it scenic, and that Mansfield section was scenic, and the Newport Yard was partially scenic. And but ultimately, I wasn't as disciplined as I should be. So that ultimately led to the demise of that layout. So. But that was actually the second layout, but that was the first one. I really consider that my first layout in terms of I got scenery, a lot of structures and stuff like that too.
But a good opportunity to hone skills and do the scenery and start to learn what you like. And obviously things that, you brought in that you eventually didn't like with kind of some freelanced ideas and stuff. When does, you said that met its demise, when does the new version start to take place?
That was layout number one. And then after I took down that layout, I ended up in an apartment out in Holyoke, Mass, of all places. My company had an opportunity in the office. I was working in the Mansfield Foxborough office at the time. And they had another office in Holyoke. So I actually took the opportunity to move out to Holyoke and started layout number two, which was actually based on the Boston and Maine strictly. And that was loosely based on Nashua, New Hampshire. So, and that layout lasted about a year, and then I decided I wanted to be back in Eastern Massachusetts. And funny, because I used to send out layout updates as I was building the layout in Holyoke, and it wasn't a large layout. It was probably 20 by 18, just around the layout. I I had a bunch of industries that were left over from the first layout. So I was able to incorporate those and get the layout up and going pretty quickly. But I used to send updates every couple of weeks of the progress. And then remember, I think it was April 2012 or 2013, I sent out an update. And all that was there is a whole room. There was nothing left. The whole layout was torn down. It was gone. And a friend of mine, Randy, the Framboys, made the comment, well, that's the best update I've seen yet. So that was the end of that layout. And then I ended up getting a house where we are now in Charlton. And the current layout started in like late 2014, early 2015. I started construction on that.
And you brought back the CP after a little bit of a detour onto the Boston and Maine. It's back to CP again.
It's back to CP. I think I always envisioned I would have a place. I had built one of the CP's unique RS2s that were assigned to the New England lines, and I had built that one for the first layout. And I knew that, I'd spent all that time and effort. I had to have another home for it. So that's what I started on the current layout. So
as you you get this new home out in Charlton that you've moved into, and you've got a space for it. Talk a little bit about the planning for it. I mean, was this something on paper? Was this something in your head? A combination of both? How did you start to put the plans together to put this layout up?
It was very similar to we were looking at the houses at the time, and we had to have a decent sized house. We had 3 kids, dog. And so we had to have a decent sized house, but like similar to the first house that I bought, I went right to the basement when we got there and looked around. And there was some. So the house has a well, and it has a water softener, and it has a furnace and a hot water and a bunch of things. So when I looked at the basement and then looked around, I realized I had a little bit of work ahead of me. So we moved in 2013. I didn't actually start the layout until 2015, but I had some envisions of how it was going to go. So at the time I had access to AutoCAD. So I was able to draw up the basement to scale and start to design track plan. And I probably spent the first year, I didn't do anything in the basement from the time I moved in. Like anything, there's a whole series of things that you have to make a home before you move into a house, but you have to make it a home. So it was a lot of stuff my wife had to do. She has a home office, so I had to help her build that out. And I wanted to finish the basement. It was unfinished when we moved in, so I wanted to make sure it was finished with drywall, drop ceiling, and everything. So I spent the first year doing that, but at the same time, I was drawing various track plans, knowing it was going to be based on CP operations somewhere around Newport. But like anything, there's trial and error trying to figure out what you can shoehorn, into a basement and try and take as much advantage as you can of the space. So that's what I did initially. I drew it to scale, and I had passed it out to a bunch of friends to get their input in terms of what I thought would ultimately work. And I wanted to have it, I wanted to have operations, and a couple of the goals I had, I also wanted to have it around a walk around style layout with staging and stuff. So I really wasn't a fan of duck unders or things like that. So that was all in the back of my mind when I was building the layout. Just make it easier. I'd been to a lot of layouts, and there's nothing wrong with duck unders and things like that to make it work. But just for me, I always like the idea of just being able to walk with your train and not be interfered, and only see the train go through the scene once. That was something that was instilled in me from just years and years of reading various writers, Tony Custer, Alan McClellan, all the well-known names, David Barrow, all those guys were just very inspirational in terms of having the train run through the scene more or less once, or and incorporate staging and things like that. So that was always in the back of my mind as I was building the layout.
Yeah, so inspired by some really great layouts, and now you've got this plan. And I can imagine that year, I know you stayed busy, obviously, finishing the basement and all the tasks that you had to do, like you said, to make your house a home. But it must have been a little challenging not to have something that you could have immediately. That must have been a real test of patience for you.
It was. I used the time wisely, I guess. I was still building plenty of models. I was building structures at the time that I knew I would use, and certainly building motive power and other things. But I just knew from some of the previous layouts that I had that how important to me anyway is that having a finished basement was, and just one of the layout that I had in Holyoke didn't have a finished basement, and it just, there was a lot of dust down there, and I knew just from operationally wise, it was a constant battle trying to clean track and things like that. So anything I could do ahead of time for this layout to minimize that. And even now I still have a lot of problems with dirty track and stuff, but anything I could do to minimize that with a drop ceiling and ultimately getting painting the floor and things like that, just go a long way towards minimizing the amount of maintenance you have to do later on, I think. So
dust control is a very wise suggestion to think about. You know, like you talked about covering floor joists, because you would imagine the dust that comes off of a floor joist that, you know, in a basement, and you find it out when you're cleaning track. And, you know, and then we talked about dust control earlier when you were mentioning, extruded foam and the dust that creates, or, you know, learning the lesson of never cut homosote or even masonite in your basement, because it just becomes a nasty dust cloud. And yeah, it's just hard lessons learned when you're scrubbing that track, trying to get power to roll back through it again.
Nothing beats having a shop vac that using, you know, a wet dry shop vac, and you take the filter off because you're sucking water, but you forget to put the filter on, and then you're downstairs cleaning something. I've made that mistake a few times, and just watch as, you know, I turn around and I can't even see the other side of the room. There's just a big dust cloud. I'm like, oh, great. All right.
Yeah. So it just made my job twice as hard. I took whatever was sitting, and now I've made it airborne again. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. Yeah. So, but yeah, really good advice about, you know, finishing basements. I surely wish I was able to get that done at the point I was before I was building my layout, and very wise to think about those things before you rush into putting bench work down, and get those kinds of projects done first. But well, fast forward, you got your drop ceiling in, you got the floor painted, you got some sheetrock up, and it's looking good, which also really helps with presentation too. It really is nice to walk into a finished room and see a layout too. It just adds to that whole effect. But you're at that point. Tell us about the build of your Newport and Lyndonville subdivisions.
Yeah, so it was, I like I said, we moved in the house in 2013. I think I actually started the bench work. It was around October 2015. And I still have a video out there. My buddy Steve Kearns was over for the weekend of the Springfield show in January. And I had actually got bench work up, I think, on at least 2 walls of the basement. And I got tracked down, and we have a little video of the first official inaugural run of, I think it was an RS-18 running through what would now become Orleans on the layout. So we have a little video of that first train, and then work progressed pretty quickly. But one thing I did too that was, I'm very glad that I did, was so the layout's about 28 by 32, and I had finished the majority of the basement, probably 3/4 of the basement, but there was a quarter of the basement that I didn't get to. So the layout actually started basically just around the layout, around the room, around the walls. And I was able to get some scenery done in a couple locations. I have a town called Bradford and a town Orleans, which basically I was able to get those up and running with scenery initially. And there's a whole center peninsula that I didn't actually start on that until 2017. But the benefit of that was I was able to get trains up and running and have some operating sessions, even though the rest of the basement wasn't finished. And I could, like you say, I was anxious to get started, but this gave me the opportunity to get trains up and running and kind of all those juices and to flowing creative juices to get something going in scenery. And that was something I'm glad that I did initially.
Yeah, got the flywheel turning, and then of course rewarding to be able to get some trains running on it. And even though it's not completed, at least it gives you some form of feel of accomplishment and some satisfaction to be able to at least do some operations on that layout.
Yeah, especially I think there was some pent up frustration. I had a lot of rolling stock, a lot of locomotives and stuff that I wanted to get out and get running. And so that was the layout started with basically just around the walls. And where my current Newport yard was or is now was actually just used that as a staging yard initially with 5 or 6 tracks. And then it went around the room, and I had a couple finished towns, but I was able to get, 3 or 4 guys over for operating sessions and get trains running and enjoy the layout, enjoy the hobby without kind of being bogged down with, 2 or 3 years worth of bench work and not be able to actually enjoy it. So that was good. And I'm glad I did that initially. It kind of, all that built up frustration and pent up energy was able to be expelled or expended and used up and get enjoyment out of the hobby a lot sooner than if I'd been stuck building bench work for a couple of years.
Yeah, it definitely helps with those small victories, right? Keeps you going, keeps that motivation going.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a bit about the purpose of your layout, the Newport and Lyndonville subdivisions, and what it fully represents in its current state?
Building a layout, I'd always hoped to have operating sessions. I think a lot of people, when you build a layout, you actually want to have people come over and enjoy the layout. So that was always in the back of my mind when I built the layout, that I wanted to ultimately have operations. But also, a selfish side of me too, wanted to just be able to create someplace that, again, not like a club where I could just make the decisions myself. But I think probably one of the aspects of the hobby that I really enjoy more than anything is just the photography side of things. So building this layout, I wanted to have the ability to do a lot of photographs. So to that end, I've created a lot of areas where it's just more or less rural running, and I can create that sense if anybody's been to Vermont, whether it's a CP or the CV or the B&M, there's just a lot of beautiful areas of Vermont, the scenery in itself. So having the ability to kind of recreate that in the basement is something I just aspired to, creating a lot of those scenes with backdrop photos, with scenery and stuff like that. So trying to recreate that and be able to photograph it and get generally realistic photographs was always something that drove me, in addition to the operations. And that's why with the operations, I wanted to have more of a walk around style. So for operators, they could come over and just walk with a train and just run through a scene, and stop and take photos if they wanted. That was always something that was important to me too.
As you're starting to put this all together and you talk about the photography of it, so you want to create these scenes, and anybody that hasn't go to Neil's YouTube channel, NRS 8400, there's some beautiful videos that show these, the quintessential Vermont scenes that you've created are just absolutely amazing and really do take you to that rural Vermont area. Just absolutely gorgeous. Talk about operations on there and what would one expect, and what is the railroad doing on your layout?
CP operations in Vermont is probably, it's certainly not going to compare to even, let's say, the CSX Boston line nowadays in terms of traffic. There's just not a ton of it. So that's primarily why I model 1980, because that was probably the heyday of the CP operations in Vermont. There's a lot of things that happened in the 80s. One of the biggest changes that happened was the abandonment of the Main Central Mountain Division, which was a big source of interchange and bridge traffic for the CP. So the CP in Vermont is essentially, it's the northern end of the B&M's Conn River line. So all the traffic, the north-south traffic that was coming up the B&M Conn River line would either go towards the central Vermont, towards St. Albans, or it would go up to CP. And at the same time, there was traffic coming from Portland, Maine, off the Main Central that would come into St. Johnsbury. So I wanted to model kind of as much of the traffic as I could, and capture as much of the traffic as I could. So that's really why I selected 1980, because 83 was when the Mountain Division was abandoned, and that's kind of siphoned away maybe not half the traffic, but probably 40% of the traffic. So setting the date at 1980, not only did it get both Main Central and Boston Main traffic, but it also was also able to use some of the earlier Alco locomotives that CP assigned to Vermont lines, including the S2s and the RS2s. But by 1983, those were retired and the RS18Us kind of took over. But that time frame, 1980, there was really only one road train in each direction. There was 904 and 917. But ultimately there was actually still a lot of extras that ran in that time, and there was some locals as well. So all in, there's probably maybe 10 to 15 trains that ran during a typical day on the CP in Newport and Lyndonville Subdivision. And Newport Yard was the hub of that, with trains coming southbound out of Canada. There was actually a line, the main line was down from Farnham, Quebec, but there was also a line called the Quebec Central that came down from Sherbrooke. So those combined at Newport, and you would get, quite a bit of extra traffic. And then there was southbound trains. One train would basically go straight to Springfield on the Boston Main, and then there was some other jobs that went to the main central at St. Johnsbury. And there was all the traffic patterns were always changing. Sometimes it was extras, sometimes it was timetable trains that ran, sometimes they didn't. I was actually very fortunate to get my hands on some Newport train registers for the time frame I'm modeling. And these were, talk about gold mine, these actually have the locomotive consists in them, the loads and empties, the time.
Yeah.
And that was just eye-opening, because one thing I found, in addition to the timetable trains, there was actually a lot of extras that ran. So that was very helpful in designing and modifying my operations to say I could almost run as many extras as I want for various reasons. So that helps with operations, I think, as you start to expand operations and things don't get stale. You get to have an extra run or something a little bit different. So every operating session doesn't feel like you're doing the same thing all the time. So,
yeah, I think that's a really cool and important element. Boy, you've done some extensive research and learned a lot about their operations, and you were able to apply it to the layout. When it comes to scenery and the geographical areas that you're covering on the layout, in compression, we seemingly, it doesn't seem like most layouts end up being able to cover it all. What were some of the things you were like the must-haves to be able to cover this?
I definitely Newport Yard, I think. There's two towns in particular. Newport Yard, which was the operational hub of the Newport or the CP's Vermont lines, but there was also a very large feed mill at Richford, Vermont, Blue Seal feed mill. It was just a massive complex, and I'm actually in the process of building it right now. And I was downstairs today, actually getting ready to do ground loop and scenery on the area as I start it. But those were the two primary towns. The Richford feed mill, primarily because it was the largest industry in CP's Vermont lines, and that had prototypically there was probably 40 or 50 cars a day that went in and out of that feed mill. So it had a dedicated switcher, and it had a road local that would actually sit off and pick up cars there and then ferry them to Newport. And at the time, in the 1980s, they still had a lot of 40-foot boxcars with bagged feed that would ship all through New England. So if anybody remembers back to the early 80s or 70s and 80s, and you see those CP 40-foot boxcars around New England, and there was a good chance they might have been coming out of Richford with bagged feed. So those two locations were definitely towns that I wanted to incorporate in the layout. But one thing I didn't want to do, for a variety of reasons, I didn't want to model some of the very larger towns, like on the Conner River line, like White River Junction or St. Johnsbury, which are just fantastic towns from a modeling standpoint. But from my standpoint, there's a lot of challenges that come with trying to model such a iconic location, let's say St. Johnsbury, just because of the amount of time it would take to build the structures. Some of the cities and stuff like that. That's one thing I tried to avoid. Really, I just knew the amount of time it takes to build structures, and I just didn't see myself having the time to build like the St. Johnsbury station or the ET and HKI building. If anybody's familiar with St. Johnsbury, it actually still exists. But those were you kind of have to choose your battles in terms of what you're going to model. And I would have loved to have modeled those. And I have a friend of mine, Jim Ranington, who's modeling that. That was also modeled at the Providence Club, Model Railroad Club. But I just couldn't see myself having that amount of time to just build all those iconic structures. And so I tried to focus, other than Richford and Newport, I tried to pick smaller towns, which is why I modeled Orleans, Vermont. It was a large Ethan Allen plant, but that seemed doable to me in terms of building the structure. And some of the other towns that I modeled were just much smaller and didn't take a lot of effort, or as much effort, to build as, say, like one of those larger towns like a St. Johnsbury or White River Junction.
Yeah, so you kind of knew you kind of figured out your why, and and then again, what your limitations were, and you built a layout that you basically was achievable for you, and what you knew you again had time for, and what you wanted to focus your energy on, and these scenes that are just again incredible. And I'm looking at even just the thumbnails of your videos, let alone watching them, just some gorgeous areas. And you've got this area, and I'm not sure exactly what it is. Maybe you can tell me here, where you've got like a small agway, and then you've got a general store, and how the road just kind of flows and then goes up a hill, and then you can see there's an overpass in the background. Just absolutely gorgeous work you've done here, Neil.
I appreciate that. And that's funny. So that's that's Bradford. And Bradford's actually one of the fictional layouts or towns on the layout. But that came about. So as I was, getting back to designing the track plan, I had about 3/4 of the track plan figured out, but there was one area of the basement that I just ended up with a space that could certainly handle a town, but it just didn't fit an actual location on the Conn River line that I could think of. But there was in Bradford, there was actually a large, and prototypical, Bradford's actually on the Boston and Maine, which is south of the CP line, south of Wells River. So the CP operations north of Wells River are owned by the CP, and south of Wells River, it was the Boston and Maine. So this section, Bradford, that you're talking about, is actually south of Wells River, and it's on the B&M. But knowing that I would have, run through trains anyways, Bradford was a good spot, and it actually had a very large Agway feed dealership there. And prototypically, there was that same Agway feed mill in Bradford, but the track layout's quite different than the prototype. In some of the structures that I used, that general store, and there was a feed and grain dealership, a wooden grain dealership that was actually left over from the Mansfield layout that I talked about earlier. Yeah. So I had this section of the layout where I had some structures that were from previous layouts, and I was able to incorporate them into the town of Bradford. And it's actually worked out really well. I have a local that comes out of staging that comes in there with a B&M Jeep or switcher, and it's a good hour worth of fun just to come in there and switch out the Agway feed and the wooden grain facility. And it's fictional, but it's still has that Vermont character, I think, to some degree. So
it was exactly what I was going to say to you. You may be freelanced, but it is authentic Vermont. It has that look. You've done right down to the road signs and everything else. It tells you you're Vermont, but you wouldn't even need to see that. You look at it and you know that it's that northern New England look, and absolutely outstanding scenes.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah.
What would you say is your favorite part of your layout?
There's a couple. I mean, I think anybody that's built a layout, there's times I come down and there's sections of the layout that, I think anybody would agree that you might not be happy with. And there's places I come down the layout and I won't even look at the location because I just don't like it in the back of my mind. I'm like, I could have done that better. But there are some areas I'm pretty happy with. I think probably my favorite is there was a location called, there's a round barn at Barnett, Vermont, on the CP, which was just south of St. Johnsbury. And it's kind of an iconic location from a rail fan's perspective. And it's actually, the round barn itself is a historic location. But in that early Trains magazine that I talked about earlier, there was a really nice photo there, I think taken about 1980, with a B&M McGinnis Jeep and a couple another B&M Jeep, and like a CPRS 18 coming in the background, and this beautiful round barn in the foreground. So I was able to model that on the layout. Part of the basement is actually a walkout basement. And I knew even when I was designing the layout, I was going to have to bridge that gap across a couple walkout doors. And in the back of my mind, I thought, well, geez, it's got to be about it's actually about 5 or 6 feet long. It's going to be 3 feet deep. And I had to come up with a way to bridge that. And I didn't want to necessarily do like a removable section. I wanted to be semi-permanent. So that's really how the scene at Barnett came to be, is I actually built it. It's about 6 feet long and about 2.5 feet deep. And I actually have it on coasters. So if I do have to take it out, I can pull it out, slide it into the aisle if eventually the hot water heater or something's going to go. So I knew I was going to have a means to get it out. So that's probably one of my favorite locations. There's nothing more than just the track in the background, but I have a nice photo backdrop there that I actually took at the real location. So the hillsides and stuff for the actual from the photo that I actually took there. So, and it was the round barn was a bit challenging to build too. I'm not the greatest. Everything I do with structures, not the greatest at measuring. So I cover things with a lot of body putty to make it work, but also, because it's very complicated. It's round, it's got a pitch to it, and then there's a little steeple at the top. But I can remember trying to figure out how to do this round barn and make it all come together. And but ultimately, it came out halfway decent, so I was happy with it. So
that's great. That's great. You mentioned your backdrops, and your layout is a lesson in how to blend backdrops for sure. And when you're looking at these videos, it's just amazing how much it looks like the layout's just continuing on and on and on. And you've done just a fantastic job with that and blending roads. Talk about your backdrops and, how are these photos that you acquired, or tell us about how that all came to be?
And so the backdrops, I really can't take credit for them. A good friend of mine, Mike Conflone, had taken. So I had taken all the photos myself, but I don't know Photoshop or anything else, and I'd actually sent all the photos off to Mike. He put them in Photoshop, stitched them together. And Mike's got an eye for color that I don't have an eye for color. Let's just say, wouldn't say I'm colorblind, but Mike has an amazing eye for color. And he was, so I sent him the images, and I put a package in the mail with Woodland Scenics medium green ground foam, and then some of the Silflor static grass that I was using. I sent that up to him. He was able to literally take those materials in front of them on his screen and match the colors together.
Amazing.
So that really helped provide that seamless backdrop effect that you get. So Mike did a bunch of the backdrop, probably did half the backdrops for me on that. So I really got to give him credit for that. But most of the locations of the backdrops themselves are taken at the prototype locations for the most part, and able to stitch them together. But I learned early on the importance of backdrops. A friend of mine growing up, we were friends with, was a gentleman named Dick Elwell, who passed about a year and a half ago. Many people probably know Dick Elwell, but Dick Elwell's layout, I think the first time I saw his layout was about 1990. And he was the first one I had ever seen that really did backdrops, like just long backdrops behind everything. And that was an eye opener to me in terms of wow, like just wow. That's the term, like the first time you ever come down into Dick's layout, you just saw this layout that just went on forever because you had these beautiful backdrops, and Dick was modeling the fall. So you had, just real nice fall foliage color scenes and stuff like that. So that was the inspiration for the backdrops, but I can't take credit for most of the backdrops in the basement. Mike did a lot of those and sent them off to printers. But I found there's actually a print shop in Auburn, just a town over from me. He does. He's actually a frame shop too, but most of the more recent backdrops I've done, he actually is familiar with Photoshop, so I can actually send photos to him, and he prints them out for me, and I've had really good luck with him too. So,
yeah, well, they are certainly excellent, and they're certainly just very well done. And again, I will share the link to your YouTube channel where you can see all this work and the way the roads are beautifully blended together. And again, the scenery just all blends, and your layout, as far as I'm concerned by video, just goes on for miles and miles and miles beyond. So looks outstanding. But as we're wrapping up here on Around the Layout, I want to really appreciate you coming along and telling your story. I do want to ask you, you mentioned in the beginning your dad and your relationship that you and him have had, and now that you've got your layout, what's Dad think about your layout, and how often do you get a chance to come over there?
Oh, he like I said, he was just over for Christmas, and my dad will listen to this eventually. I would say my dad's my biggest publicist in terms of very proud of his son, which if he only knew the dark side of things, he'd probably know better. The little brat that he knew growing up. But, That's definitely nice to be able to share that with him. And the great thing too is he's when he bought a house down in Warwick, Rhode Island, about 10 years ago, and he's actually recreated this layout in his basement, the Neponset Ridge Short Line Part 2 in his basement too. So I'm still able to go over there and have some fun in his layout too. So it's really good.
Has he ever come over to your layout and try to take over with steam like you did with his with the diesels?
He probably would. He actually came over a couple months ago and brought a Shay with him, and he helped me. He wanted me to program it, but he was pretty excited to get he brought it down, put it on Orleans, and we were running a Shay on the layout. So that was kind of neat. So.
There you go. So you got a little bit back at you. Was able to run some steam on your diesel powered layout, but. Neil, I am so thrilled that you came along here and came to tell your story here on Around the Layout. It's been a blast, but I got to get up there and see that layout. And I'm sure once we do that, we're going to be talking about the next time you come on the show, because we'll be talking about operations and a bunch of other things that you've got going on in your layout.
Oh, you definitely got to get you up for an operating session.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. But until then, again, Neil, thank you so much for being a part of the show.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.